Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see such a full room. I don't think in all of my time here at SITES I've seen this room so full. I finally did something right and got an early slot for hosting, and I think that this is the way to go. Anyway, great. Great to have you all here. My name is Sanam Vakil. I am the James Anderson Professor, Lecturer in Middle East Studies here. And I am very excited to be back in Bologna for a new semester, starting today for me. And I have with me a colleague of mine from London. We've worked together for a long time, Dr. Neil QUILLIAM. And he has agreed to speak about his forthcoming book, which he will introduce to you and talk about Syria, Realism in Action. But I have to say that Neil wears many hats. He is not just a Syria expert. These days, we tend to be pigeonholed as the X expert or the Y expert. It's very important in life to be more than one thing. And Neil works on many things. He is an energy expert, a geopolitics expert. He follows foreign affairs and international relations of the Middle East for quite some time. He's recently also published a book on Saudi Arabia and youth, which is quite a hot topic, of course. And Neil is the Energy Research Director at SRMG think and the Saudi think tank. And he's also a partner at Azure Strategy Consulting. He was previously head of Chatham House's Middle East North Africa program. So I have his job, and they're big shoes to fill. There he worked on the Gulf, he worked on Syria. He served as a MENA energy advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is the British State Department. And he was a senior analyst at Control Risks in London and a program officer, UN in Amman. So he has a wide array of experience, deep understanding of the Middle East. So it's my great pleasure to have you here in Bologna, my other home. And we're keen to hear about your book. After Neil's presentation, we'll have a hopefully vibrant Q&A and discussion. And yeah, over to you, Neil. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Sanam had promised me 5 students in the room, so this is rather fantastic.
Yes.
A little intimidating. Never be persuaded by people's bios because they always seem very, very long. But I think it's very difficult for anyone to declare themselves an expert on the region. I think the region keeps changing and giving us new things to consider. So I still consider myself a student, a student of the region. I'm still very much learning. I'm really happy to be here today, and I will sort of talk a little bit about my book. I've got 30 minutes to talk about Syria, and 30 minutes is quite challenging. I was asked by the particular publisher to explain, using sort of a light touch IR theory, how the Assad regime has survived. Now, language matters, of course, and the Assad regime surviving itself needs sort of understanding and unpacking and unpicking, because the regime is still somewhat on the back foot. So we could say it has survived to date. Doesn't mean that it's going to continue to survive. And the regime is more or less in control of its country, but there are large swathes of Syria that sort of fall beyond its remit. And it's also beholden to Iran and to Russia. So we need to sort of dive into that a little bit. But before we sort of get into that, I wrote a PhD centuries ago. And at the time, I wanted to explain how Syria had managed to survive what was then the New World Order, how it sort of shifted its position from being within the Soviet sphere to moving to a sort of unipolar world, and how it managed to, not ingratiate itself, but how it managed to kind of traverse that shift in polar order, having been pretty much on the naughty step, certainly for the US and for the Western powers for a very long time. They've been a sponsor, state sponsor of terror. So I was quite interested in understanding that. So when I was asked by this publisher to explain how the Assad regime survived, it was almost like a very similar challenge. It was like, okay, let's go back to the drawing book. Let's have a look. What are the fundamental factors that enabled that to do that? I use realism as a model. I'm a die-hard realist. Might not be very fashionable. It comes and goes in fashion at various points. It's something that I've kind of anchored myself to, and I use it to explain very much how the regime has survived. So I said, language is important. How we set Syria within context is very important. But one thing I always think about when I'm looking at international relations is history, context, and connectivity. When we're watching the news today, when we're seeing conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, or conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, there's a strong connectivity to the past, obviously, where that's come from. And there's a strong connectivity to where the Syrian regime sits in this frame, and I really want to touch upon that. When I wrote my PhD, I was asked to summarize it in sort of one sentence, and I just used 3 words, and that was at the time, Assad is boss. This was the father. This was Hafiz, and if you ask me now, how has the regime survived? I probably couldn't do it in 3 words, but I would certainly say environment, changing international environment. I would say Russia, and I would say Iran. I mean, in a nutshell, that's how it survived. So I do want to kind of pick and touch on that. In my book, I talk about classic concepts of realism, balance of power, which the regime has been very good at sort of playing. I talk about the consolidation of state power. I talk about the importance of alliance building. And then I talk about primarily for myself, it's about changes in the world order and changes in the regional order. So let's sort of take a little bit of this at a time. We maybe just go on to this. So I don't know how familiar you are with the map of Syria, but I just thought it'd be worth just sticking it up there. You can see where Damascus is down in the southwest. You can see right up in Aleppo in the northwest, right bordering Turkey and Idlib. These are all key regions where the government lost control during the civil war or during the war. And then you've got the northeast area up in Hasaka and Raqqa. Raqqa's obviously very famous because ISIS took that for some time. And in this area now, we have the Kurds that are sort of holding and occupying some land. I'll touch on those in a minute as well. So Syria is it's a relatively small state with a relatively small population. It doesn't have a great deal of resources. When I was in the Foreign Office at the time of the Arab Spring, I was asked because I was an energy security advisor. I was asked to estimate, if we put sanctions on Syria, what would it mean for the global markets? But Syria was producing at the time maybe 500,000 barrels of oil. So bearing in mind Saudi Arabia produces 9 to 10 million barrels of oil, it didn't really matter. And it was dirty, thick oil that nobody really wanted. So Syria was this sort of almost inconsequential state in the region. And it had been for some time. But during the time of Bashar's father, Hafiz, he came to power when he became president in 1970. I guess so. I haven't really made it so it flows too well. Okay, we can situate where Syria is in the region, always very good. Next, bordering Iraq, bordering Turkey, very, very important there. Obviously, Lebanon, super, super important, and you can see the Israel and Palestinian territories, and then Jordan immediately to its south. So didn't have the resources of Saudi Arabia, certainly didn't have the resources of Iraq, but it managed to utilize its position, its geographic position exceptionally well because it borders Israel. So Hafiz, I'm going to call him Hafiz, it's easier. The father managed to seize power 1970, consolidated his grip on power in Syria, hacked into key institutions of the state, which were the Ba'ath Party, the security services, and managed over time Syria comprises and composes different ethnic groups, of course, and you'll be aware that the Assad family came from the Alawi community. They traditionally were marginalized. They were a small population. They were considered to be sort of peasants, but what they did in a similar way to Saddam Hussein in Iraq through the Ba'ath Party was sort of percolate up through the state institutions, through the Ba'ath Party, through the security services, through the Air Force, through the defense forces, until they reached kind of almost like a critical mass, and then began to organize as an ethnic group and I had a very strong organizing principle, and it tried to sort of develop and shape domestic policy, certainly along the lines of like security first policy. So Hafiz came to power, began to consolidate his position there. And he came at a time on the back of the '67 war. He'd been Minister of Defense during the '67 war with Israel, when the Golan was lost, when Sinai was lost, when East Jerusalem was lost to Israel. So when he came through to power, there was a shift. There was the beginning of a shift in the global balance of power, I guess. And the US was very much kind of courting Egypt, trying to pull it onside, pull it away from the Soviet Union. And in doing so, in '72, it made Syria a much more important power. And so we have, from the period of '72 onwards, and this is why it's important, this is why I talk about history, and this is why I talk about connectivity, we have like a strengthening of the Russian relationship, or the Soviet-Syrian relationship. We have, a lot of Syrian young officers going to be trained. We have a lot of Soviet defense material coming into Syria. We have a lot of Russian-speaking Syrians, and you get the foundations of this relationship, which are very strong and persevere. At the same time, if you fast forward to '79, so these are just important dates to bear in mind. We have the Iranian Revolution, which I will be teaching about, I'm sure. And most of the Arab world turned their back on Iran because you had a revolutionary state in Iran that was one for the overthrow of essentially the monarchies in the region. And the one state that was supportive of the Iranians was Syria. Not because it wanted revolution, because it certainly didn't want revolution. But if you look at the map here, and you can see that where Syria and Iran are, and you've got Iraq right in the center there. And Iraq was a traditional rival of Syria. So you had Saddam Hussein in power there. You had an alternative Ba'ath Party in Iraq. So you can see from a kind of balance of power point of view, it kind of made sense for Hafiz to sort of say, okay, we're going to align ourselves with the Iranians. There was an 8-year war between Iran and Iraq between 1980 to 1988. And most of the Arab world mobilized behind Iraq. But Hafiz kind of hung on. He supported Iran throughout that. The country, Syria was a long time what we call a frontline state. So it had those borders with Israel. So until that point, it had managed to sort of leverage or get rent from the Gulf states, who would effectively buy arms, would give it money to support it in its competition with Israel. But during the Iran-Iraq war, some of that funding started to dry up because Syria was supporting Iran. So that relationship was very, very important and is proven to be very, very important. Because the Iranians at the time were, it's hard to say they're isolated, because that's such a huge country, right? And the revolution promised to change the whole part of the region, but it had very few kind of regional allies, and the Syrians really stood by them. It really diplomatically, politically, it would support it. It would lobby for Iran also inside the Arab League. So it was building up kind of political credit. So you've got a balance of power. I think you see that balance there, and you've got a building up of credit. And I think the Iranians felt very I think they felt very grateful ever since for having that sort of level of support. And obviously I'm talking about Russia here, and I'm talking about Iran here, because those two relationships have proven absolutely pivotal in the Assad regime surviving. But let's talk a little bit now about the shift in environment and how that enabled, I think, Bashar to sort of navigate this piece. Post-Iraq, Iraq 2003 US-led war against Iran, international environment had started to shift. We had more or less 2003, you could argue, was kind of the hiatus or the beginning of the end of the unipolar moment. So the US was engaged in a long-term conflict in Iraq, which drained tremendous resources. Equally, European powers were engaged and pulled into that. So when the Arab Spring started, 2010, the international environment has sort of reached a point where, or I should say the Western powers had reached a point where, they'd almost overstretched themselves for decades. They spilt, too much blood and treasure. But they were reaching a point where, the domestic constituencies were tired of this. Too much had been spent. So we started to see, limits of projected Western power. And this was absolutely critical in shaping the sort of Syria conflict. When I was asked to explain, why or how the regime, the Assad regime survived, of course we saw Mubarak go, right? We saw Gaddafi go. We saw Ben Ali go in Tunisia. And I remember, talking to colleagues at the time and just saying, okay, Assad's on his way out. I didn't want to be one of those few voices, but because at the time, there was this almost great sense that these strong military leaders were being pushed aside by their populations, and it was something that was greeted quite happily at the time. But I remember just sort of sitting in small circles with colleagues and saying, I can't see him going. I can't see Bashar going. I'm not sure why or how. But then we started to see little things that would come through, which were indicative of why and how he would do it. First off, he learned from his father to give nothing. And what I mean by that is to give no reforms, maybe cosmetic reforms, but to give nothing away, to hold on and to retain power. Security first was the first thing. And then when we think of Hafiz, I don't know how much you know about the region, but in 1982, Hafiz, his brother actually, termed it, there was an Islamist uprising in 82 throughout the country. It had been going on effectively since 79, but it started to materialize and become quite critical. The regime, the Assad regime, just sent the tanks into the city of Hama. We don't know how many were killed, between 6,000, those are the conservative estimates, 25,000. It's bulldozed. I mean, they literally pushed the tanks in, utterly and absolutely ruthless. Completely. So bearing in mind that this lesson was learned from the sun, sorry, there's all these little interesting anecdotes and stories come around. So bearing in mind that the sun had seen this. This was something that probably sat within his consciousness. When Bashar became president in 2000, so his father died. He was still, I think he was 38. There'd been this great debate sort of amongst policy circles as to what would happen when Hafiz eventually went. He built this state, this personalized state, all about him, all around him. Built institutions, they all kind of fed in, and they were all cross-cutting, and he had this control. And there was this question of, this is a republic. It can't go from father to son. It's not one of the monarchies. There was a preferred son or a favored son, but he was killed in '94 when he was driving from Damascus to Beirut. It was a car crash. So the next son, Bashar, who was this kind of gangly looking, very tall, awkward ophthalmologist, was suddenly sort of in the limelight. So he was brought in, and at the time he was sort of brought in, and it was what happened after father died. They had to rewrite the constitution or amend the constitution because president had to be 40 and above. He was 38, so they amended the constitution. They put him in, and at the time I remember everyone was quite hopeful. They thought, nice young guy, he's coming in, studied in the West, studied in London, got to be a nice reformist. He married Asma, she's a Syrian heritage, but a British merchant banker. Great, this is the moment of change. This is the moment of optimism. In Jordan, you'd had King Hussein die, and then you had King Abdullah coming into position. Hussein was a very different kettle of fish, but Abdullah was a young leader coming in. His wife Rania, very great for the Western press, and quite a reformist. And in Morocco, you had King Mohammed VI. So you had you had this generation of young leaders coming up, and there was a sort of sense of optimism there was going to be change. And actually, when Bashar did come in, there was a little bit of political opening. Political salons were allowed to open. The press had a teeny bit of freedom. I was having a conversation yesterday. So I was living in Syria at that particular time, and I knew one of the, well, we both know him, but I knew one of the sort of up and coming journalists who was able to sort of write a little bit critically about the regime. Couldn't really touch on Bashar, but they were pushing, and there was this sense of optimism. And then he overstepped the mark, of course, and he was imprisoned. And this exercise was kind of close, very, very quickly shut down. And the reason I'm sort of taking you through this little bit of a journey here is because coming back to, changing in the international environment, a lack of willingness from the Western powers to intervene again in the region. But we did have, President Obama at the time in 2012 say, we're not going to intervene in Syria, this is going to play out, but we're going to draw a red line here when, if they use chemical weapons. I mean, you all know the story, right? I mean, the red line didn't ensue. It wasn't, they used chemical weapons. There was all that discussion at the time. You set the red line, you set the deterrent. Bashar has really pushed on this button. And what's going to happen? Yes, the Russians swooped in. They came in with a really nice kind of package. Yes, the Syrians were going to stop producing. Yes, the Syrians were going to stop using. The materials would be exported out of the country in a relatively clean way. It didn't happen, of course, in exchange for no intervention. And so Bashar saw this and thought, okay, this is a key moment, right? So he had basically stared down the face of the barrel of the gun and survived. So he knew that, that kind of, I guess that political will to do something just wasn't there. So for me, that was like a critical moment. Then, we fast forward to 2014. 2014, Russia moves into Crimea. Nothing happens, right? So Putin thinks, okay, I can take Crimea. We can have, alarm, we can have sanctions, we can have, we can have a lot of rhetoric and discussion around that. But that gave him license, really, to step into Syria. I see I talked about connectivity. I see the two things very much kind of aligned. The Russians moved into Syria wholesale in September 2015. I remember the day really, really well. And at that time, there was a real expectation that the Assad regime was kind of on its back. The opposition, which had been supported by the West, and armed by the West, and armed and supported by Qatar, Saudi, the Emirates, it had really started to make inroads into the country. And it looked as though there was, it's a horrible term, but but they use it now because also I get away with it. Kind of useful Syria, kind of the backbone of Syria, where from Damascus out to the oil fields effectively, and then up the spine of the main cities. The regime was beginning to lose some of its, its territory. It was certainly losing a lot of personnel. So the Russians moved in, and I remember the day because we had at Chatham House, we had a visitor from the US who had been in the administration and just stepped outside of the administration because he was very frustrated about the red line. And he said, I can't believe what's happening in DC at the moment. Everyone's really excited because they think the Russians are going to get bogged down in Syria. And there's almost like a sense of glee. It's like, this is going to be like another kind of Afghanistan, but for the Russians. But of course it wasn't. I mean, they moved in, fairly wholesale. I mean, they moved in material, they moved in supplies, they secured the air bases, they secured the ports that they wanted. And of course, there'd been a long-term relationship there, so there was an element of trust. But they really kind of stepped in, and they really helped the regime survive. I mean, they were, and there was nothing internationally to challenge that. And it wasn't as though the US could push back against that, right? And also, I mean, Obama had made it clear. I mean, Syria didn't really sort of fit within the national interest. And certainly for other Western countries, it wasn't that important. which is very sad, but that's the reality of where they sat. So 2012, red line, really very important. 2015, September, really important because because the Russians come in. And then throughout, from 2013, 14, Iran and Hezbollah, they had come, and this is where it's really interesting now, they had come to the aid and support of the Syrian regime. Hezbollah in particular, I mean, Iran most certainly in terms of missiles, in terms of deploying personnel in areas of criticality to the regime. How am I doing?
You're good.
In terms of criticality to the regime, and Hezbollah spread from Lebanon, equally supported the regime. But what you've got suddenly, and so combination, I would say, of Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, underpinned, undergirded with Bashar's regime. And in effect, and in a sense, it survived, and I'm saying it survived up to that point. And what allowed it to do that was shifts and changes in the international order, was these very important alliances that it had built up over time. We have, so now and I, we work quite closely with Sir John Jenkins, who's former British ambassador. He was an ambassador to Iraq, to Saudi, to Syria. When he was being posted to Syria, I remember sort of being called in and asked, you go and you brief the ambassador-elect at the time. And then at the end of the session, you speak for an hour, and you're supposed to give them one piece of wisdom. And I remember saying to him at the time, and this is, don't underestimate the Iranian relationship, because there was always this desire, there always this goal. We can pull the Syrians away from the Iranians. We can get the Gulfists to come in, and they can fund it, can bankroll it. And the Gulf Arabs themselves also believe that. But I remember just saying to him, this is something very, very strong. So that relationship, because of what happened in '79, remained and was very, very strong. But what we have now in Syria is we have a Syrian regime that still doesn't hold, still doesn't have authority or control over the whole of the country. In the northwest, you have HTS, which are cooperating, loosely aligned, working with Turkey. So northwest is controlled and managed effectively by Turkey. There are talks on normalization there. You have Kurdish groups, which is sort of managing the northeast. And these are sort of outside the remit of the Syrian regime. But arguably more important is you have two other big actors. You have the Russians, who came in and saved the day in 2015. But they want their pound of flesh, of course. They want to maintain their position in the ports. They want to hold on to their strategic advantage, particularly in its competition with the Western powers. It needs to hold on to that, and it's not going to let it go. But I think deeper than that is the Iranian influence and Hezbollah's influence inside the country, because Russia tends to operate on a kind of state-to-state basis, on an institution-to-institution basis. So you have defense sector to defense, security to security, economy to economy. But Iran kind of came in, and if you have a state structure, it kind of operates at the sub-state or the understate structure. It came in, it brought in mobilized fighters from Afghanistan, Chechnya, Iran, Iraq, all around. It has been, I can't think of the words come from my head. It's been settling populations, Shia-dominated populations, but from other countries, inside key areas and towns inside Syria. So shifting and changing the demographic of the country. It has loaned, it's been supplying oil, both crude and product. almost continuously, but it's given, it's given the Assad regime a tremendous credit line. The figure runs into maybe like 150 billion a month, some kind of crazy. So the regime has survived, but the price or the cost of doing so is very, very high. Now here's the sort of the little twist with here's a little twist with this. There's a really good book written by Ben Scheller on Syria, on the Assads, on the father and the son, and it's called The Waiting Game. Brilliant book. And she says that so when we used to look at the father, we would look at how he would, how he would manage his relationships with Iran. He eventually restored relations with the Gulf Arabs. He managed to bring in a lot of cash from them. He managed to traverse the shift from the bipolar world to the unipolar world. He deployed during the liberation of Kuwait in 1990-91. He deployed 15,000 Syrian troops alongside the US-led coalition to liberate, Kuwait. I mean, think about that. I mean, they didn't do anything, but he timed it perfectly to kind of get in the good books. Some analysts would say, he was like a genius, or he was this kind of chess player. Bente actually said he was a person who was inert. He was like a rabbit in the headlights. He did nothing. He just looked and did nothing. And once he did nothing, once he just kind of hunkered down, the environment shifted and the environment changed, and that enabled him to survive. The father I'm talking. Now the son. Okay, so we've gone from Arab Spring. We've had red lines. We've had the Russians coming in. The other piece I didn't mention, because there's so many things to mention in 30 minutes. ISIS, of course, massive, right? Establishing a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. We can talk about that because there was a facilitation of what that was. But ISIS was another major challenge in the region. We've had earthquakes. We've had COVID. But, okay, the waiting game. He survived, and now he's waiting, and this is how I see it, right? Iran has embedded itself deep within the country. Russia has these structures, but what's happened over the past 18 months, 2 years? I mean, Syria was kicked out of the Arab League. It used chemical weapons on its own people. We stopped counting. The UN actually stopped counting, but 600,000 killed, 8 million outside the country, 12 million displaced inside the country. So pariah, when Biden called MBS a pariah, I mean, think where Assad kind of sits within that spectrum. And the Gulf states, he kicked him out of the Arab League. But now, one by one, step by step, Saudi's restored full diplomatic relations. The Oman has never really broke it. Jordan's restored full diplomatic relations. The UAE has restored full diplomatic relations. The UAE, Saudi has embassies inside the country. So you've got this very strange situation where whether he's this tall, gangly guy who was a hopeful reformer. I mean, I don't think he was a reformer, obviously, from how I've described it, to being, to being what he is, this ruthless, utterly horrific human being who's, gassed his own people. And yet, there's this desire to sort of bring him back into the fold. And he's just sitting there waiting for that to happen. And how that will happen, it's not entirely sure. How it's not entirely clear. What his regime has done, and what the Iranians have done, and what Hezbollah has done, from a state from a country that's impoverished by over a decade of war, meaning those who are in the sort of regime-held areas and also those in the opposition-held areas. It hasn't really produced oil for a decade. But they've managed to work themselves into the drug trade. into producing Captagon. They produced Captagon it's an amphetamine and for a very small amount of money. And they are now flooding the market in the Gulf. So passing down through Jordan, going into Saudi, going into Qatar, all the 6 Gulf states, and then suddenly making themselves very rich. And this is almost like an independent source of wealth, but it's also leveraging power. You know, so Saudi Arabia, but MBS, right, on his vision 2030, transforming the country, population, we know the figures, you know, whatever it is, 70% under 25. They're really worried about them because Captagon is coming in, you know, it's been snipped in oranges and pears, and it's just, you know, it's just flooding the market. So suddenly, you know, the Gulf leaders want to have this conversation with Assad. It's like, okay, we are going to normalize, we are going to restore diplomatic relations, but the price of that is stop sending your drugs to us. But what's happened so far, say, restore diplomatic relations, no money's flowed in yet, but the drug flow hasn't stopped. He's kind of pocketed that. He's kind of said, okay, we've got diplomatic relations now, that's great. We're going to keep sending this stuff to you guys. And I'm making myself really, really rich. So I can sort of see this kind of shift. It'll be hard to dislodge the Iranians. Syria is not whole or complete. I'm going to finish that. It's not whole or complete. But this, you know, this regime has effectively survived. And I just want to say just one final thing. This, you know, we hear about the deep state, and we talk about the deep state, and some of it is conspiracy, and some is not. But there's something that's common to a lot of Middle Eastern states, and that is, you know, there is a hard core of security that surrounds whatever leader comes into being. And there is, I would call it an internal security logic that becomes exceptionally persuasive. So I've seen it in Jordan. I've seen it with King Abdullah, who probably is a lot more reform-minded. But you know, when he was young king and he came into position, he didn't expect to come into position. You know, the security apparatus came around him and said, "This is how we function. This is how we work." And the same goes for Bashar. Whether Bashar, you know, the question was always, is he a reformer or is he a bad guy? It didn't really matter because that internal logic that guides how Syria is managed was there right from the outset. So it's not to say that the dice were already loaded, but he had, you know, there was very little room for maneuver because that internal logic was there. This is how we survive. This is how we're going to manage this, you know, this space. And you've got a difference between, say, Jordan and Syria. The Jordanians have got it a little bit more comfortable. But there was this moment, I'm just going to finish with this, there was this moment during 2011, March 2011, you know, the Arab Spring had sprung right across the region. Children in the southern city of Daraa had been killed by, you know, some of the regime thugs. And Bashar hadn't come out, he hadn't spoken. And because there was this kind of expectation in the country that things could still go the right way, when he went to parliament, everyone in the country, I mean, was just waiting for him to come out and say, "We made a mistake. We're really sorry about that, guys. We're going to work with this. You know, we understand why, you know, we don't like it, what you're doing, but we understand why you're protesting. We're going to introduce reforms. We're going to do that." But that moment, he just said, you know, "We're coming. Anybody protesting is, you know, is in the pay either of Israel, in the pay of the Western, you know, Western leaders, or in the pay of the Islamists. And we're going to come and we're going to kill this." And boom, that was it. That was the moment. And I think until then, because we'd seen you know, Jordan manage its Arab Spring relatively well. That for me, that was the defining moment of that particular period. It was this, you could see there was this opportunity, this moment. That's why I say, even if he wanted to reform, I'm sure he didn't, but that security apparatus around him just said, we don't give an inch. We're gonna push heads. There you go. That's how they survived.
Thank you. Wow. Powerful. And very real. And I think a very good case study in general for understanding broader regional dynamics, broader leadership dynamics across the Middle East. And thank you for infusing a bit of IR into the discussion, as well as bringing in sort of the role of the external actors that remain very relevant today. I think this provides a really good scaffold or backdrop to understand a lot of the regional shifts that we're experiencing. And you spoke, I think, quite well about the changing world order and the changing regional order. And the Middle East continues to be a taker of this shift as we are now in this multipolar order. So I might probe you on that, but I want to ask you one question, and then I'm going to let you all think about what you want to ask Neil about Bashar. Because I remember when Bashar came to power and his wife was, as my old science professor used to call her, Babe. They were all like Queen Rania and Asma al-Assad, you know, they were always photographed in Vogue wearing their Manolo Blahniks, and everyone thought, oh yeah, here comes reform. And Bashar al-Assad was interviewed regularly by Western media, Barbara Walters, you know, what do you listen to on your iPod? Thereby, you're gonna bring about reform. And the West was hungry for reform in Syria. So, you know, thinking back to their personalities and of course, the systems and the politics, you know, realism clearly applies in Syria. But, you know, Syrians now are displaced, refugees strewn from Lebanon to Jordan, all the way to Germany and the United States. The Syrian diaspora is very large and, of course, deeply impacted. How are they handling the survival of the regime? And secondly, the United States and many European countries, you know, are not there yet. They're not welcoming Bashar al-Assad back anywhere. In fact, Syria is heavily sanctioned. So how do we reconcile his, you know, his survivability, the region's practicality in dealing with him, and then, you know, this external broader opposition? You know, how is he going to navigate that, knowing what we know about his very wily father?
Thank you. That's a lot of questions.
Sorry.
Great. No, that's fabulous. So when we think about the region, okay, and we think about the external powers, if we went back to 1990, or even before that, but 1990, that was, you know, that was a unipolar moment. US-led coalition came in, liberated Kuwait, and didn't push on into Iraq, but liberated. There was very much a sense, I think, at that time that the Western powers could come in, could shape, could manage regional orders, right? So, but we've gone from a position where there's been this deliberate engagement with a plan. I think, you know, I think what we've seen for almost for the past decade, or certainly for the last 5 or 6 years, is that we live with conflict, right? I mean, Libya is still a state in conflict a good decade afterwards. Yemen is in a complete mess, right? We've got, I mean, just after October the 7th, I remember having conversations, and I was quite often asked, as I'm sure you are, you know, when do you think this is going to end? When is this conflict? And I thought it would go for at least a year. And now I'm thinking it's just going to go on. So to answer your question, I don't see sort of Syria kind of, you know, there was that phrase, right? People used to talk putting Syria back together. I don't see that happening unless there's a massive shift in the global order, unless there's appetite or a willingness to do that. And at the moment, there isn't. I mean, who is going to do that, right? Western powers aren't going to do it. China has zero interest in it. Russia does not have the capacity or the interest or the will. So I think Syria is just going to remain as is. And that diaspora that's set around the world, it's not going home. We had a Syria project at Chatham House that ran from 2013 to 2015. And what we were trying to do with our project was to get policymakers to think long term, because policymakers naturally think about today and tomorrow. I mean, that's where the focus is, and they've got to think about election cycles. But at the time, we were saying, think about this population shift coming out of Syria, what it means. Now you've got however many now, and the figures on 2, 3, 4 million in Turkey, right? You've got 1.5 million in Syria. You've got displaced all around the world. But very few are sort of thinking about the long-term consequences. But when you look at any study on conflict, when populations leave, it's a very, very small percentage that actually ever return back. Because the structures have shifted, the structure. So how are Syrians coping with the survival of the regime? I mean, those who are outside the country, I mean, they got on with their lives. Obviously, they rue that. We know quite a lot of Syrians ourselves, right? But I mean, they've established themselves in other jurisdictions. They built on their lives. They still have that connectivity. But actually, it's the Syrians in the regime-held areas and in the opposition-held areas who have the really hard life, because they have no means to alleviate, one, the insecurity they're living with, and two, to really kind of generate a sustainable income. And then when you have a regime that's managed to sort of ingratiate itself into this drug market and to generate income, I mean, with populations that are at a distinct disadvantage, but it's going to go nowhere, right? That's how I look at it. I mean, Libya, like I say, Libya's a mess. The Western powers have kind of stopped not bothering, but it's going to go nowhere. Sorry, your other question?
That's okay. It's already quite depressing. We don't want to completely depress them at the start of the semester. Let's open up and hear the questions. If you have any questions, comments, please catch my eye and please introduce yourself. Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
I am Sergey Radchenko, I'm professor here. Really great presentation, really enjoyed this. We've got a historical question, a contemporary question. Historical, when you talk about Hafez al-Assad backing Iran after the revolution in 1979, then he is at the same time, this is a Soviet client, right? And the Soviets are not friends of Iran by any stretch of imagination, because Iran supports Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Actually, the relationship is very tense. Can you explain that? How was he able to do this in spite of the fact that the Soviets have this bad relationship with Iran that doesn't actually move into 1989? And the second question, also related to Russia, you talked about the Russians getting into Syria. I mean, one thing for me that I could never understand is, why do they do this? Okay, there are historical reasons. In the 1960s, they were doing something there. At that time, they were supposedly, building socialism, or pretending to do so, or hoping to do so. But what is there now? And I've heard different answers. Like, I've heard answers that it's strategic, it's important for some kind of military presence, for Middle East. I've heard something about a pipeline. Is there a pipeline that they're trying to control there? That seems to be, given what you've said about oil production. Are there any other reasons for Iran to be there?
Thank you. Well, two great questions. On the first one, I think we just need to look at the environment back in 79. Yeah, no, the Soviets and the Iranians didn't have a great relationship. Absolutely. But what you did have in 79 as well, you had Camp David Accords. So you had Egypt being taken out of the strategic picture. So this left a certain kind of vulnerability for the Soviets. This left a certain vulnerability for the Soviets in the region. They only had, they had Yemen down in the south, but certainly sort of in the Levant area, Syria was the only key card, and that was just way too valuable to give up. And I mean, Hafiz was really quite good at playing countries off. he knew how to, I don't think he did, but you know, there was a security logic that enabled him as president to sort of play off the, you know, the Soviets and manage the Iranian relationship. I mean, you could often see that, and he was very good at that domestically as well, in that, you know, he would accommodate, he would give backing, and his son did the same as well, of course, to, you know, sort of Islamist groups whose ultimate goal was to overthrow republics or overthrow the states. But he would bring them into the country, he would fund them, he would support them, and then, you know, like a cat, he would squash them when he wanted to get rid of them. But he could utilize and play on that, and I think he was able to do that with the Soviets and Iran, play those off at the same time. The Russian interest, I mean, there are different factors there. It's definitely not a pipeline. I mean, they don't think their oil is almost immaterial now, and they certainly don't have, you know, a rich resource of minerals. It's more about securing access to the Mediterranean. It's more about the naval base. Okay, so, but that's quite well established. It's about that strong military presence. But there's something else as well that we've seen, and that's about perception, and that's about alliance building. You know, so when Obama drew the red line and then didn't, you know, keep to his word, I mean, the groan in the Gulf states was just unbelievable. What is this? You know, who is this? Who draws a red line and doesn't keep that in place? What happens? You know, and also, sorry, you know, go back a teeny bit there. Mubarak, you know, the carpet was pulled from under his feet, right? And so there's a question then as, you know, the reliability or durability of the US as an ally. Is it a cold weather friend? Is it, you know, so the Saudis are worried suddenly if we have an Arab Spring, what is Obama going to do for us? Is he going to sit on the fence, wait for it to play out? But the Russians, you know, from their point of view, boom, they went in. And this is what I used to hear in the Gulf, is that if the Russians on one side, that's it, it's got your back 100%. You can rely on that. And at a time when, and it's still there, you know, and the Gulf states still have these kind of, you know, these nightmares. They wake up in a hot sweat wondering about, you know, the reliability of, you know, of the US as an ally. I mean, they were hit. Sorry. No, right. No, absolutely. But you know, but I mean, the Saudi energy infrastructure was hit by Iranian cruise missiles in September 2019. Nothing from the US, not till a little bit later, right? So it is, so for the Russians, it is about the strategic, it is about the military bases, the naval base, but also I think we wrap into that, you know, a demonstration that if if we're with you, you can depend upon us. And that's effectively what it demonstrates.
Thanks, very interesting.
Questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jolie. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I found it all very interesting. My question plays off of both Professor Marchenko's as well as what we're about to learn with Professor McKill. So in layman's terms, there's no real way for Syria to make a go of it without the support of Russia. And from your description about Assad, we have two very strong men, kind of playing off the idea that Russia's main, I guess, point of power right now, besides their war in Ukraine, is Syria. And we see Putin still trying to make himself appear as a strong man throughout the world, especially with Syria. Do you think that there's a chance that we can have these two strong men or modern tyrants exist, I guess, peacefully in Syria?
Thank you. I mean, they coexist side by side at the moment. I mean, the Russians are underpinning, supporting, you know, the Assad regime, but there will I guess my argument is there's gonna come a time, there's gonna come a pinch time, right?
Exactly.
But so that's a good question. It really depends how, okay, so several factors there. How, I'll call him Bashar because it's just easier, how Bashar can leverage his relationships with other states. So there's going to be no leverage with the Western states. As you know, as Salam said, I mean, that's still way off, and I don't know if that's ever going to come. But if there's a way and means to leverage with the Gulf states, possibly, but the Gulf states and Russia are, you know, they have pretty good relationships. I mean, Qatar is kind of investing in Russia, not massively. Kuwait is too. The Saudis cooperate with Russia and OPEC. So it's hard to see how at the moment, but that doesn't mean circumstances won't change, things won't shift. I mean, if Russia were to suddenly, let's imagine.
If Putin had a heart attack
Yeah.
and someone else took over.
Yeah. Then, yeah, I mean, if Putin had a heart attack, then it depends who comes in and takes over and what priority they place on Syria. So as long as Syria is a priority for Russia, as an example,
Yes.
that's that. But it's, the moment that kind of priority dips, I guess there's a moment when the terms of trade, we could call it, could be renegotiated.
Especially since we're seeing China reinvest throughout the Middle East, taking over a lot of the regions where Russia was previously kind of more active.
Yeah. I mean, I could see that. I mean, the way I would characterize it is you would see the terms of trade shifting and changing. I think Russia's going to keep its assets, its base there. But definitely that will shift. But for me, the more difficult one is Iran and how it's embedded right in the country. How they deal with that, that's a different story.
Other questions? And yeah, Syria, but you can ask Neil anything. He's a Jordanian expert, Gulf expert. Yeah, we work on everything. So please.
Hi, I'm Ian, and I wanted to ask kind of about this red line that was set by Barack Obama. So I guess my question is, like, well, I guess it pertains to like what right in the first place was there to set the red line? Like the UN Charter is quite clear. Chapter 7, I think Article 39 states that you can't just invade a country without authorization from the Security Council, which they did not have, and obviously because of Russia, especially after what happened with Gaddafi, was not going to be very willing to enact. So I guess my question is like, do you support, like, this is sort of more of an international legal question, but do you support like the like R2P arguments that were kind of laid out at this time to justify like intervention? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. No, it makes a lot of sense. I'll tell you my personal kind of judgment on that in a minute. When the red line was drawn, the options weren't articulated. So it wasn't, this is the red line. It wasn't that, this is going to be a full-scale invasion. It may have just been some cruise missile, and there were cruise missiles sent later, from Trump. So it wasn't the promise of intervention. So that was never really going to materialize. Right to protect, yes. I think that's in sufficient conflicts. No, wasn't personal to, yeah. So I would advocate for right to protect. But also at that particular time, there is that dimension to it as well. But there's an issue or there's a challenge is that if you set a deterrent and then you don't fulfill it, I mean in any walk of life, right? When you have a child and you say, don't do this, and then they get away with it. I mean that just sits there. So in a way that not enforcing it would have been better not to have the red line, but not enforcing the red line.
So it's a bad precedent moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, countries are a little more careful about drawing red lines at the moment.
But Obama's legacy in the Middle East has been damaged brutally because of that red line. Everyone in the region hates him. And I'm not exaggerating. He's despised.
Yeah.
For the line, the JCPOA,
Yeah.
the lack of defense of traditional American partners. Yeah, he, sort of is seen to be, sort of institutionalizing the double standards of American policy. So he doesn't go down very well.
Well, we're gonna take two in the interest of time, and then he'll come back to you, so please, and then.
Thank you very much. I'm Julia. I have a question. It's a little bit off topic. Maybe I'll try to get it back into topic. But it's obviously kind of on the attacks of Israel on Lebanon that have been going on. Do you see any impact of that with Jordan or Syria? Do you think there's gonna be some sort of reaction from their place? They haven't been very active in that conflict. Do you think there's gonna be any change because of these like very violent attacks?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this. My name is Alex. I'm with the Maya program. You were talking earlier about some of the diplomatic relations being restored with Syria, but also how some of these countries were asking Syria to stop distributing the ketamine. And I guess I'm curious how much of this drug trade is really affecting the economy of Syria and helping it rise, and how many of these diplomatic relations are being restored because of this economic advance from the drugs in the first place, if those kind of have a circular reaction to each other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for both questions. It's not really good ones. So I was describing, how Hezbollah and how Iran have come in, right, to support the Assad regime. And Hezbollah supported massively in terms of personnel, in terms of fighters. And as a consequence of that, they are battle hardened, battle ready. I was saying to someone the other day, if the ground war does take place, I mean, they're really well trained. They've got a lot of experience because of their engagement in fighting in Syria. But it's a great question, and the reason is because there's been a lot of criticism because Assad has done nothing. He's come out and said nothing about these attacks on Lebanon, on Hezbollah, obviously, but on Lebanon. And given their history, it's surprising, right? You would imagine that he would come out, he would criticize this, he would come out, expecting as well. I mean, they share a border with Israel. I mean, I think the reason is twofold. One, there's a certain kind of impotence around what he and his forces can do in response to what Israel's doing. Primarily because a lot of those areas are held by either Hezbollah or by Iran, and Russia has been increasing its military footprint along the Golan Heights to prevent Syria from Assad from doing something. But also, he wants to just sit this out. He doesn't want, he doesn't want skin in the game in this. He's comfortable to sit that out. And there's been a big point of criticism. Jordan finds itself in a very difficult position. Difficult vis-a-vis what's happening in Gaza. Jordan is no friend of Iran, is no friend of Hezbollah.
But say why Jordan is uncomfortable, in case they don't know.
No, I'm coming. So it's no friend of Hezbollah, it's no friend of Iran. So it can come out with some language around Lebanon. But Jordan is necessarily constrained. One, it signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1994, and that's proven durable and important. But we characterize that peace as a cold peace because it's between governments and state institutions, but deeply, deeply, deeply unpopular. And I've said it 3 times because that's how unpopular it is, amongst the population. And the reason there's that peace treaty is sustained is for 2 reasons. One, Israel is instrumental in helping secure the regime, I'm going to call it the regime in Jordan, maintaining it. And secondly, even more important, is that the US gives Jordan $1.3, $1.4 billion in aid every single year. So it can't come out. It can come out in a measured way, and it's been doing so in Gaza. It's been calling the Israelis out on that. And their relationship has never been so bad since 1994. But there are calls, on the street every day. There are big protests, and they held their elections 2 weeks ago. And now you've got 25% of the parliament, from the different Islamist groups. And there's like an increasing call. Let's end the peace treaty. Let's break the peace treaty. This does not serve our interests well. But unless there's a revolution, or unless the king is overthrown, the regime, that's never going to happen, because the relationship with the US is far too close, far too tight, far too important. Now, just add another dimension to that. So 2016 to 2020, when we had President Trump, he invested his time and his energy not only in Israel, but in Saudi Arabia and in the Emirates. So, his first visit, of course, was to Riyadh. We saw him with Sisi doing the orb thing and with the king.
It's coming back.
That's right. And then we saw the Abraham Accords, coming into being. And until that point, it was Egypt and Jordan were the sort of main interlocutors for the US in the region. And Jordan was always portrayed, as this moderate country with a lovely moderate king. King Hussein had been the plucky little king, as they called him, this lovely guy. His son Abdullah with a British mother, he's a full ally. Well, when Trump came in, it was like, no, we don't care about Jordan. It's small, it's diddly, it's not really important. Saudi, we love you, Saudi. So can you imagine now, right? So you got King Abdullah, got this conflict going on in Gaza. You've got the conflict in Lebanon. And if you dare say anything that's critical of the US or openly critical of Israel, too critical. And Trump comes in, Jordan's in trouble. So they're looking at that. So that's one of those factors.
Wait, one more thing. And their population is half Palestinian, including Queen Rania.
Yeah.
So triple whammy.
That's right. And then the second question, I can't remember. I can't remember my meeting. Sorry.
I can ask it again.
Yes.
Okay, so you were mentioning earlier that Syria has been restoring diplomatic ties with a lot of countries, but then there's the distribution of ketamine. How much is that affecting the global economy, or not the global, but the economy for Syria? And is that kind of a circular, are they creating these diplomatic ties because of this influx of money? So are these really empty threats from other Middle Eastern countries asking them to stop distributing? Are they making them a viable player?
Right. I mean, it's a really good question. There are different figures for how much revenue the Captagon is generating, but it's substantive. It's really significant. I mean, I've seen some crazy figures. I have some friends who work on it, but it's in a region of say 20 to 40 billion a year. So I mean, it's not insubstantial. And considering that sits within the hands of the regime, so not the population. So there isn't a fair distribution of wealth. So that has enriched the regime quite considerably, and that's looking to invest. So what the Gulf states are effectively saying is that they haven't quite put it in these terms, but it's we will restore diplomatic relations with you, and they have, because that's just the trajectory of how diplomacy works at some point. But the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Emiratis are saying, we would be willing to invest in your country if sounds really simplistic, but this is how we heard it the other day, you start treating your people right. That's A. And B, you stem the flow of this Captagon. We will rebuild, we will help with the reconstruction effort. Again, the UN has kind of stopped putting out figures for reconstruction. But the last figure I saw, and that was about 4 or 5 years ago, was 200 billion. You can imagine that must be around 300 billion now. And who is going to pay that in Syria? I mean, honestly, who cares enough about Syria to invest? It's a relatively small country, right? It's relatively unimportant. who's going to put that money in? Definitely not the Chinese, definitely not the Russians, definitely not the Western powers. The only ones that could conceivably do it are the Gulf states. And in the past, the Gulf states, because they were cash rich, would come with a checkbook diplomacy, and they would put money in there. But these guys have wised up over the past 10, 15 years. And they only want to invest in projects where they're actually going to make money. They will invest in a hotel, they will invest in construction.
And have long-term friends.
And yes, yeah. But there's got to have, but you also have to have a shift in the domestic environment and the economic environment to make it sustainable. So to sort of answer your question, I don't see the Gulf states advancing and pushing forward. And the reason being, and putting their money in, the reason being is because you've got Assad and his wider family, we'll call them. They're just cash rich themselves. They're just in a kind of weirdly comfortable position. And it's almost came from nowhere, right? I mean, I was doing studies on the oil economy, on the agricultural economy, and looking at ways in which, if the environment shifted, how those could be grown to help reconstruction. I mean, it would take forever. But with this Capticon thing, it just, I mean, Capticon came from Bulgaria. Looked into it quite closely. From Bulgaria, it was developed during the Cold War, and it came because of the the Soviet Syrian relationship, and Bulgaria as part of the Soviet Union at the point. There was this crossover of learning of how to develop, the chemical labs. But he's kind of sat almost pretty at the moment. And one question that you get asked quite a lot, and I have no answer, so I'll ask it myself, is why hasn't he been assassinated? And this was a question that we used to get quite a lot. Right? I don't know. I mean, it would have made sense, right, at some point. But then the problem is, if you assassinate him, what do you get next?
Yes,
Or is there anything different going to come?
yes. Okay, last two questions, and then
Sure.
I have to go to class.
Okay.
So, although you set me up really well for my class. Okay, we'll do quick three, very quick. And just introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, my name is Mateo. I'll do very, very quick. You said something can change generally in Syria in the region if there's a huge sort of shift in global order, etc. You also talked about long-term thinking, etc. Certain kind of prediction, political fiction, if hopefully, possibly eventually, Iranians can overthrow the regime. Do you think that may change the picture in Syria, for instance, when it comes to the support of the Islamic Republic for the regime of Bashar al-Assad?
He's a realist, remember that.
Name's Joe. You kept nicely, I think, how the lack of US response to the broken red line and how the Russian invasion sort of bolstered the position. I think things have changed somewhat in the last year. Would you perceive that with the Israeli strike against Nia, the strike against Shukr in Beirut, against the consulate in Damascus, and then sort of the embroilment of the Russian allies in Ukraine, the apparent weakening of these Syrian allies in any way shifts their calculus, or would you suggest they've sort of made their bed and have to fly with it?
Pass it down.
Hi, my name is William. I'm from the US, and I'm a second-year Maya student in Bologna. So my question was, we didn't really talk much about the dynamics of the Syrian civil war in your overview of the recent Syrian history. So, but something I wanted to bring up and have your comment on. I have a Lebanese Shia friend who lives here in Bologna and has rather positive feelings towards Syria and the regime because, in his estimation, they play a role in the defeat of ISIS and regional stability. But I think that's something that wasn't really mentioned, is the role of ISIS in the Syrian civil war, and the fact that ISIS is rather unpopular helps to bolster support for the regime, and the fact that regional stability is something that everyone values, regardless of your stance on human rights. So.
Thank you. Very quick, 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. You're gonna have to remind me. So this question, great question. When the civil war started, Bashar basically opened prisons. He let out a lot of the super extremist Islamists, because he wanted to militarize the protests. Until that point, the protests were largely peaceful, and they had peaceful goals. So he let those out to militarize that crisis, right? But yes, there's a duality. Sorry, I could do this very quickly. There's a duality in how the regime deals with Islamists. On the one hand, it sort of stokes them and encourages them. On the second hand, it sort of cuts them down. And it's a kind of double policy. But definitely, if you're a regime supporter, definitely if you're from Alawi or you're from Druze community, I'm just you said this share your friend, you would see the regime as being a bulwark against, sort of, I don't want to call it Sunni extremism because that's just a horrible term, but so the ISIS-driven extremism. So absolutely, yeah, I can see that one.
Iran.
Iran
Regime change.
Iran changing itself.
If Iran has regime change, will it impact everything else in Syria?
I don't see Iran. I don't see regime change coming or anything major or significant happening there. So that's I would just kind of say we would probably see more of the same. Sorry. And then the third one was on U.S. interests. Sorry, could you just articulate that just very quickly?
Have the weakened allies, or apparently weakened allies, given the impunity? And Iran as well, given that Israel's apparently able to conduct assassinations in Tehran. Does that change their calculus, or are they tied to the bets that it's left on?
I mean, Iran and Hezbollah are tied. I mean, they're intimately.
I mean, Syria.
Syria and Syria.
Syria?
With Assad, the threesome.
He's just has to wait it out. I don't think the relationship. What he wants to do, he wants. So in balance of power, he wants Iranian influence to diminish. So that would put him in a slightly stronger position, right? Same with Hezbollah, but sort of within the regional dynamic, Syria does need a strong Iran in the region to help support its interests. And that's a long-term relationship. And the one thing that the Assads have done is they make and break certain relationships with Islamist groups, but they've had this long-term strategic relationship with Iran, and they've had it with Russia. And I don't see that breaking. Even if Assad gets killed tomorrow, whoever comes in that place, that security dynamic is still going to value that relationship. It's difficult, and they're going to have to push back at some point, and they're going to want to uproot all these populations that have come in, and they're going to want to free themselves. But at the moment, they can do nothing. I mean, so we spoke to quite a senior Saudi leader a couple of weeks ago, and our question was, on the normalization with Syria, can you imagine that you can go in there and you can put your cash in and you can start to peel, Bashar away from Iran, which is what the British ambassador at the time, his answer was no. And if you'd asked him 10 years ago, he would say, yeah, we can do that. But now they're so intimately entwined, really, really hard to make that come apart.
Right. Thank you, Neil. You've taken us through a lot of twists and turns, history, which is super important to understand the Middle East. The shifting order. We're living through a really extraordinary time where things are changing and you're witnessing them change under our eyes. And what's happening today in the Middle East is one of these moments. It's that line moment that will have a longer term tail. You can follow the twists and turns and think it was one person's up, one person's down. And literally 10 days ago, everyone thought Israel was lost. Now Israel is great. This is going to keep shifting. So it's important to have the historical as well as the IR framework to understand it. And you've done that while helping us also understand the Assad regime. And it's a really valuable and important case study. So thank you for coming down. Thank you for giving us our time. And we look forward to having you back in Millennium. It's great.
Is it that gonna be that?